Three. Hello everybody. Last week we looked at creating textures, in particular color textures. Color textures that we could apply to our 3D models in 3D modeling and animation software such as Maya, or that we could apply to our models in a game engine like the Unity game engine. This week we're going to look further at creating textures, but we won't focus on just the color properties, but also some of these other properties such as bump, transparency, and specularity. By having multiple textures on our materials, multiple textures that affect these different properties of our materials, we can create very convincing materials such as plastics, wood, metal, and so on. So I already have a document here, and it is 2048 by 2048, and I think the first property we'll start exploring will be transparency. So I'm going to create another layer here to work on. We'll keep this background white, but what I'm going to do is use my marquee selection tool to create a rectangular selection, and I will use my paint bucket tool with the foreground black, and I'll simply drop a black color into this rectangular selection. I'll create yet another rectangular selection. But this time, instead of dropping in a solid black, we'll try creating a gradient or a ramp. And I'll draw my ramp or gradient into this rectangular selection, and we get this. Perhaps I will also duplicate this. And with it selected, I'm going to go over to Filter and look at my filter gallery, and I think I will pick, in fact I already have it picked because I used it earlier, Poster Edges, which will give us this nice stepped gradient here. And to finish this off, I think I'll do another rectangular selection here. And I will fill that in with black using my paint bucket tool. And I'm going to change my foreground color to white now. And I'm going to select this tool here. It is the custom shape tool. And I'm going to select one of the shapes here, one of these preset shapes. So what I'll do is draw in one of these ostriches, and I'll switch the color now to black and draw another one here. Okay, and now I'm going to go ahead and save my image. I've got a Photoshop file here which is using layers. I'm going to simply save it as a JPEG. And we'll go into Maya and test it out. So here we are in Maya. As you can see, I already have a couple objects in here. I have a yellow sphere and a red plane. I'm going to go into my hypershade and create a new material for us to test this out on. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and apply this material to my plane, and I'm going to take a look at this texture in the color channel, the texture that I just made in Photoshop. So we'll come in here, select it, and apply it. Now we currently don't see it in Maya, and that is because if you're familiar with Maya, you already know that 4 on your keyboard is wireframe, 5 is shaded, and 6 is textured. And what you'll notice is that we have that image that I created in Photoshop now applied as the color channel on this polygon plane here. Now, my actual intention with this texture is to use it as a transparency channel. I just wanted you to see how it could be applied as a as a color texture instead, but I'm going to go back to my hypershade and I'm going to put the red shader back onto this polygon plane. I'll select my material, and this time, instead of working with the color channel, we will try out the transparency with that very same texture. So applying it is the same as applying it to color. I'll simply click on the checkerboard here, go to File, click on this folder, navigate to my, my texture, and apply it. And here you'll see that it's been applied as a transparency channel. So we can actually, the areas that are black are completely transparent. If you remember, I created a gradient here, and what you'll notice is that it becomes more and more opaque the further we go right. Here we did it in a more stepped fashion, and once again you can see that it becomes more and more opaque the further we go right again. And then here's the ostrich, and as you can see here it's a cutout and it's transparent, and here it's opaque and we don't see through it. In fact, these textures can be used for a lot of different properties. So far we've looked at color and transparency. We could also apply it to our bump value. So I'll create another Lambert, apply it. Perhaps we'll make this, this one green, just why not? And what I'll do is apply it to the bump map, that very same map we were looking at. Once again, click on the checkerboard, select File. This time I need to apply it to this property right here called bump value. So I'll click on that, click on the folder, and select my map. And now you can see that it's actually affecting the bump. It makes it look like it is an embossed surface. We'll go ahead and take a look at one more property. So once again, off to my hypershade, I'm going to this time use a blend. I'll apply my new blend to this surface. The thing that's different about a blend as opposed to the other materials I just created is that the blend has a specularity to it. It has a shininess, which you can see as I move my camera around here. We can go ahead and give this one a color as well. Perhaps we'll make this one cyan. And this time I will apply that same map, but this time I'll apply it to the eccentricity. And what you'll notice here is that different parts of this mesh have a different level of specularity to it. You can see that, for instance, this area that I painted just a solid black has no specularity. It's very matte. It's as if it were a Lambert. But then, depending on the gradation here, we get varying amounts of the specularity. You can really see it right here, right now, as my hot spot with that light gets into the darker area of my gradient until it finally disappears. The more I go in this direction, the bigger the hot spot becomes. Perhaps we'll see it a little bit more here as well. With this gradient, you can see how that's being affected. So here we are back in Photoshop, and I'd like to take a further look at creating bump maps. So I'm going to hide this layer here. I think I'll create another layer, and perhaps what I'll do with that is put kind of a neutral gray on it. And I'll create another layer on top of that to draw on. So let's try this out. I'm going to select my brush tool. And I'll change my foreground color back to black and just draw a couple strokes on here. Perhaps I'll change the color of my brush to white also. We can try a couple other things here. Still my foreground color is white. I'm going to go ahead and drop a white kind of dot in there. We'll go ahead and put a black one here. And I'll switch it back to white. Let's try making the brush a little harder. And we'll do a black one as well. And finally, we'll play a little bit around with one of the filters here. I'm going to make a marquee selection here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Filter, Render, Clouds. And we'll create this cloud effect here. And perhaps I'll go ahead and duplicate that and move a copy of it here. And with that selected, I'm going to go to Image, Adjustments, Levels, and we'll just play around a little bit with the levels of that, just to get something a little different. Perhaps that would be good. And we'll say OK. So we'll bring this now into Maya and we'll test it out as a bump map and we'll see what we get. Let me go ahead and save it. Once again, I'm just going to save it as a JPEG. And we'll go over to Maya. So here we are in Maya, back in Maya. One thing maybe before we try that out, I'll just show you once again as a little bit of review. We created a bunch of different maps earlier to test out in particular transparency. And here's our transparency. We also explored, well, here it is as a color map. Here it is as a bump map. Here we're just looking at the very same texture. And then here we looked at the specularity. In fact, maybe we could see that specularity a little better if we play around a little with the color of it. Maybe that helps a little. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is create another material. I'll just make a Lambert this time. We'll go ahead and apply it to our mesh here. And once again, I'm going to come over here to my bump mapping. I'll choose File under the bump value. Click on that arrow, click on the folder, and we'll find our map that we created to test the bump map. And when I apply it, here it is applied as a bump map. And we can take a look at the different different marks that I made on this document. One thing I'm going to do really quickly is I'm going to adjust the level of bump on it. What I can do is select my material, go to my in and out connections here, select this node, the bump 2D node, and then I can adjust this bump depth. You can see if I make the number smaller, the effect becomes a little less pronounced. If I make it larger, it becomes very pronounced. Usually you can use a pretty small number here. I think the other thing I'll do so that you can see the bump map a little better is put a light in my scene. So I'm going to go to Create, Lights, Spotlight. I'll look through my light here, and we'll turn on light in our perspective window. You can see what my light's doing here. I just think with a less direct light, you'll be able to see the way that the bump map is working. Okay, so let's take a look at this. If you remember, I made these marks here. If you also remember, the background is gray on here. And I made some marks that were white, and I made some marks that were black. The thing to keep in mind here is that the lighter the mark, in this case, if it's white, it'll appear to pop out of the surface, and if it's black or if it's a darker color, it will appear to be indented into the surface. So you can see these various strokes I made, and you can see the effect that the bump map is having on them. If you remember, I also made some marks here where I made a mark that was very soft edged, both of these, and then I made another that was harder edged, and you can see the effect that that's having. And then we tried just making some render cloud using the render cloud filter here, and you can see that makes a very nice looking surface there. It almost looks like a very rough rock surface. And then here we played around with the levels, and we get a little bit of a different effect there. Now, the thing about bump map, of course, is that it is affected by the light. So you'll notice that as I move my light around, the way the bump map is affected changes. It's actually responding to the direction of my light. Now, up to this point, we've only been looking at these textures on a simple polygon plane. But, of course, you should understand that you can apply any of these materials to any other mesh that you might have. So here is the sphere with that very same bump map that we applied to the polygon plane. Notice here how nicely, even though this surface is smooth, it gives the illusion, using a bump map, that there's more modeling there than there actually is. Notice how this is just catching the light, which makes for a very nice effect there. Now, a couple things to remember also. We looked at both transparency and bump in this video. And you'll remember that, in fact, both transparency and bump, when I created them, I used black and white and gray values. And that's what we typically do when we make transparency maps or when we make bump maps. We usually use black, white, and gray values. We don't really need the color values for these maps. So That's it for this video. In the next video, we'll take a look at some practical uses for bump maps and for transparency maps. I hope that you found this video useful, and thank you for watching.